Right. No countdown or anything.
It's cold intro.
Yeah. So last week our accountant sent us some business expenses. They had an email that had like a few listed and said like, hey, what are these? Like, can you help us categorize these? Mine were all related to like some meetings that we'd been hosting, but I noticed one of yours was the Lightphone. Is that what it's called?
Yeah,
What
yes.
is that? What's that
The light
about?
the Lightphone 3. Well, this is my I sort of realized like, oh yeah, my expenses might be the the topic for conversation because
It's
you'll be able to see them.
like a social feed of
Yeah.
your expenses, business expenses.
Yeah, I've been used to for a few years having my personal business, just being in business for myself, having my business expenses be unobserved by any
Yeah.
outsider, except my accountant. So it's a Lightphone 3. I don't know what the Lightphone 1 was
Okay.
actually.
When it came out, it had sort of a Kindle-esque type
Well,
of
yeah,
screen.
yeah, but I think that's also the Lightphone 2. Maybe the
Okay.
Lightphone 1 and 2 were kind of similar. Anyway, I'm not quite sure, but I have either a Lightphone 1 or a Lightphone 2. And honestly, I it would be hard for me to justify, impossible for me to justify, based on my experience with the Lightphone, whichever one I have, buying another one because I never really used it and it bricked. So now it's just like it doesn't
Oh,
even turn
wow.
on. Yeah,
Crazy.
but I find the idea really compelling. The idea with the Lightphone is it's this black and white screen, and it's a really simplified smartphone.
Hmm.
So the Lightphone 1 was just a cell phone, but the idea with the Lightphone 3 is it has maps, it has music, it
Oh,
has
interesting.
a flashlight, it has kind of the core set of stuff that if you think of the iPhone being introduced and
Yeah.
minus the browser, like some of the iPod in your
Yeah,
pocket.
it's kind of like the good, non-distracting, non-infinity
Yes,
pool type of stuff that you would want to have on a smartphone.
totally. So it's kind of an attempt, and I've found recently that there are there's a constant battle to keep the distraction free iPhone, which, as you know, that's this thing that you and I have both been doing for years. It's the idea that you take any infinite attention potentially sucking thing off of the phone. And normally on my iPhone, I don't have Safari. I don't have any social media stuff. I don't have anything that's potentially got infinite information, and it helps keep me kind of sane and focused a bit more on whatever the thing is in the moment that I'm doing. But lately, for example, the ability to turn off Safari in the
Mm.
phone broke. So
Oh,
it's
wow.
I could there are probably ways I could figure out how to block it with a third party app, but I just don't have good self control. So
Yeah. You
I
and
will
Apple are like doing battle. It's like
just,
a tit for tat.
yeah, yeah. And you can't imagine it's like super high on their priority list
Right.
to
Whichever
fix.
PM is like responsible for that feature is like, man, nobody shuts off Safari. Who would
Nobody
do
shuts
that?
off Safari. Yeah. It's annoying though. It actually is annoying because it's parental controls, right? It's supposed to be part
Yeah.
of like screen
Yeah.
time and
Yeah.
parental controls. You're like, really? Like that doesn't work? That was your big thing a couple years ago.
Yeah.
So the light phone is in this big category of gadgets where I buy them because I think almost like you're making an investment in a startup, like an early stage startup. I think most of these I'm not going to ever use, but every now and again there's going to be one, and
Yeah.
it's going to have this. It's going to be a hit, and it's going to open up something new for me. So
I
that's
went
the
through that
light
with
phone.
the like the wave of new like video conferencing cameras that came out. There was like the Opal, which I still use sometimes. The Opal. There was another one called like Lumi, or I don't know if you know the one we're talking about.
Yeah. I can't remember the name, but yep, I remember
Like
there's
there
another
was a
one.
couple of
Yeah,
years when like there were a bunch of those coming out. I like bought all
yeah.
those. And then there was like more recently there's been like AI native devices like the Rabbit and the Limitless Pin, and I've like bought all those. I have not even opened the box of any of those that I have received yet. Uh, Not sure what to do with that information, but I totally know what you mean. Like when these new things come out, it's like you want to bet on them, and there's a chance that like one of them will be useful. Yeah, it's kind of fun to like be a seed investor in those new products.
Yeah. And the funny thing is, I think there actually is. depending on the kind of work that you do, and like I think the kind of work that we do, there actually is a payoff sometimes. Like it could be a payoff in an insight into like, hey, the way these folks did their UI here or whatever, the way this product is positioned, the way it's differentiated in the market, that lends an insight that we in turn share with one of the companies we invest in as kind of a lightning demo.
Or maybe that it's not differentiated, right? Maybe that like there's something that is initially appealing to us. Like there's a hook where we're like, oh, that's cool. But then it doesn't deliver on that. It doesn't follow through on the pitch that it made to us as customers.
Yeah. And that's interesting too. You learn from that. And there are these cases. And I'd say like an example for me would be the Remarkable tablet, which is this kind of e-ink screen, just a thing for writing on. And that one has turned out to be really useful for me. I've gotten a ton of this sort of disproportionate value, and it occupies this really space for me that like the iPad doesn't solve it. My laptop doesn't solve it. My phone doesn't solve it. And so there's always the hope that it's going to be one of those. And so we'll see. As with any of them, my hopes for the Lightphone 3 as an individual thing are not high, but it is one of those basket of bets.
Yeah. All right. Should we kick this thing off?
Let's kick it off.
This is Jake and Jay-Z. This is Jake and Jay-Z.
Okay, this is the very first episode of Jake and Jay-Z. It's our new podcast. And what are we going to talk about on this podcast, Jake?
Well, we're going to talk about startups. We're going to talk about design, probably, products in general, things that are interesting to us, what's going on in our lives and in the world. And those are some of the things. What else did I forget?
Yeah. Well, we are, among other things, the co-founders and general partners at Character, which is a seed fund. So we'll also talk a lot about what we're seeing kind of on the ground working with startups at very early stages as they design new products and bring those to market. But mostly we want to have fun. We want this to be sort of an entertaining, different flavor of podcast, a podcast that you can put on and kind of feel like we're just having a conversation. We're hanging out with you. We hope you find it interesting.
If not, we'll have a good time. So what do we have on the list for today?
All right. So, well, the first thing I wanted to talk about was something that we did last week. We, for the very first time, did an in-person kickoff of Character Labs, which is a program that we run with pre-seed founders a couple times a year. Jake, do you want to kind of explain what Character Labs is? And maybe we could chat about just some of the reflections on how it went doing it in person for the first time.
Yeah. It was wild to be in person. But yeah, before we get into that, Character Labs is basically, so we started Character a few years ago, and this gave us the opportunity to invest in a super early stage company. We realized like, you know what, we could put together a program where we got a few companies at once. It would make sense for us to spend however much time we thought was the right amount of time with them. And because they're just getting started, it would also make sense for us to put together like whatever we think is like the perfect start. Like if you were beginning a big project, you're beginning actually your startup from square one, what would be the perfect sequence of things for you to sort of figure out in those first weeks? And so, man, that was awesome because it feels like forever when we were like going way back to working at Google, working on products, when we were working as partners at Google Ventures, when we were working with startups who were, maybe they were Series A or Series B. They're like, we kind of get, dropped into whatever phase they might be in. It was never that perfect first moment. Well, it was occasionally. Yeah. There were a few times when we hit that. Flatiron Health was right at that moment, for example.
Digit was another great example where I remember being on the whiteboard with Ethan when he's like, I think it should work like this, and literally just like sketching out the idea. But it was sort of random, right? It was sort of like sometimes it would be this really perfect early moment where I think you and I have the most fun and we think that we can help people the most. But that was sort of the exception. More often than not, it was, the company was a bit further along, and they always had interesting problems and challenges that we could help
Totally.
with, but it wasn't that really special start, that special beginning moment of the company.
Yeah, and obviously with the design sprint that John and I have been creating, evolving over all these years, we were really into the start. So it was so cool to realize, okay, we could craft this. And then so Character Labs is what came out of that. We're on what, this is the fourth time we've run it.
Yeah,
so,
we're right in the middle of the fourth group right now.
Yeah.
Which is confusingly called G3. I mean, it's not confusing to me because I think for some reason I find it very amusing that we started with 0. It's like nerdy reference that like lists start with 0. But yeah, it's G3, which is actually the fourth group.
Yes, it does make the math slightly counterintuitive when you try to figure out what number we're on now. So the notion with Character Labs is start off with a foundation sprint, which is a thing that we do now. It's kind of a very, very beginning, very early kickoff, sort of forming the rough draft of your strategy for the project, and then go into a sequence of design sprints. And so this whole thing takes place over the course of 4.5 weeks, and it's really great. It gives teams a chance to go from kind of 0 to having an idea of what the product might look like, and maybe trying to build some confidence in product market fit. And that's what we really tried to tailor it to. Yeah. What does it take to build as much possible confidence that you're on the right path to product market fit before you start building something? So they leave Character Labs and they're like ready to run in that direction.
Yeah.
And always having overcome a lot of dead ends and false starts, because that's what happens when you are in the early stages of an idea. The form of it won't be exactly right, and we can figure that out in days and weeks rather than months and years.
We have 7 companies in this group. We always try to find 5 companies, but more often than not, there's too many good options. So I think first time there were 8, the second time there were 5. Then I think now we've had 7 twice in a row. So we have 7 companies who are working with us. And one thing I was meaning to mention to you was that one of the founders who's like, and pretty much all of the founders are like pretty technical, right? They're mostly engineers, or maybe an engineer who became a product manager or something like that. But one of the founders who's an engineer, we were having lunch, and he was like, it feels really weird to not be writing code. Like I feel uncomfortable. I feel anxious that I just like, I quit my job. I started this thing and I'm not writing code. Right. And I was like, yeah, I get that, but also that's kind of the point, right? Because when we look at what that team is trying to figure out in labs, it's like, well, what code would you write? Because they have like kind of these 2 very different directions. There's always some, I think if you have an idea of the market you're in and the problem you want to solve for customers, like there's always some foundational stuff you can start building, some sort of scaffolding, infrastructure that you need to build your product. But really these 2 founders, they have 2 very different approaches to solving their customer's problem. And so I hope that by the end, they will say like, that was different, but that was good. Right. Now, when we start writing code, we know that it's something that our customers want. We know it's something that when we show it to them, it's really going to click with them. But it was just, I don't think anybody's ever said it quite like that to me. I don't think any founder's ever been like, just straight up like, this feels uncomfortable to not be coding right now.
Well, it's fascinating because that discomfort, I mean, how true is that in all kinds of situations too? Not just when you're an engineer who just left your job to start a startup. I mean, you're like, oh my God, got to get this thing going. We're always chomping at the bit to make progress that we can see in a way we're familiar with. And I always feel that way when we start a writing project. I'm chomping at the bit to write words, and it's very important though, to make sure that effort that can then unspool and quickly become, as I said, like months and years, is headed in the right direction. I mean, it's funny to think of it as slowing down because we move so uncomfortably fast, really, in these sprints. But it's all about trying to make sure that code gets written on the right, to create the right form of the right thing.
Yeah. Have you ever done like a race, like a running race?
Like once.
Okay.
And also at field day when I was a kid.
Okay.
But only like once have I run a 5K.
So I ran track and cross country when I was in high school. And I was
Okay.
just thinking about this because of the Olympics and like watching sprinters. And, when we work with teams, we usually run sprints, the name for kind of how we work together. And I was thinking about how, like, obviously the race is fast, right? The work, if you will, of the race is fast. That's the whole point. But I was reflecting on how, like, the moments before the race are like the slowest moments of time like possible. And I think that's kind of what it's like when we work with startups in a sprint. And maybe this is sort of like what that founder was saying about feeling slow, feeling anxious about not writing code.
Oh, yeah.
There's this very slow period at the beginning, this uncomfortably slow period when you're sort of like getting ready and collecting your thoughts and like making sure that when you do press go and go as fast as you can, that you're totally set and you're totally ready to make the most of that burst of energy.
Yeah, totally. I watched not a lot of the Olympics, but I did watch the 100-meter. I was struck by one of the runners before they got even in the blocks, came out and was kind of just jumping around, mugging for the camera, and I was like, oh man, like, save your springs, you're gonna have to run like right now. But I mean, obviously, and I think maybe even he won, but I was really impressed that what's that?
It works for him.
Yeah, it works for him. Yeah. But I was really impressed that, like, he's got like that much excess, excess bounce, and it still has, because at the Olympics, you have to put everything in. I'm imagining for that stretch, and it's kind of that nervous, excitement energy that you feel when you're at the beginning of something new, and so often I think that excitement, it's really important and powerful, but is really crucial to harness it in the right direction. And totally. To get it pointed the right way, because it's gonna lead you off the blocks fast. But if you're like running parallel to or I don't know, at a 90-degree angle to the course, this metaphor should probably stop.
We've reached the end of this metaphor.
But so we were in person.
So what did you think?
Wild. I loved it.
Yeah.
It was so different. And it's so funny that it was so different, because we used to say we're never doing stuff over video. We tried a couple times in the pre-pandemic era to do design sprints with teams when people were in different locations. And I just remember it being a mess. It was so hard. People's video and audio was always screwy, and the collaboration tools weren't there. We would use like Google Slides or, Google Docs. It was just a mess. And
just for background, like, you ran essentially the first design sprint was in 2010 with the Gmail team. Right? And then you joined us at GV in 2012. And then, like, from then until COVID, like until 2020, we ran probably a couple hundred design sprints, and maybe 5 of them were like remote, or there was a remote aspect, and usually it was like one unfortunate person who was like in a different office, and we were only sort of like half paying attention to them. But when COVID started, we were like, okay, I guess we're gonna have to like figure out how to do these sprints in person.
We have to do them over video, and
over video. Yeah.
Then that was a struggle. That was a total pain. And then it turned out Miro was really great for it, and we've created templates in it now, and now, right, just like everyone, but we're doing so much stuff over video. And it's turned out that with these startups, although I think you and I have been totally ready to go do sprints in person, it just, most of the teams are distributed. Usually is the case that when you want to do a design sprint, you should do it right away, and it's hard to schedule travel and coordinate everything in time. Better to just get going. So it was weird to do it in person again, and also fantastic, but also felt weirdly, you and I both had this observation, that it felt slow. It was, when you were doing steps with paper and sticky notes and whiteboards, it's slower than if you're working in parallel over video and you're filling out things in a template that we've had the opportunity to design and think about and put the instructions in, and it streamlines a lot of the actual narrative and explanations we have to give. And there's so many nice advantages to doing it over video, but it loses this one key thing, which is when you're actually in person, the connection that you make with the people who you're working with is really powerful. And our colleague Kristen was saying there's also something about just embodying some of these things that are on a whiteboard or on the wall, and you're physically you're making whenever you're making a diagram of something, or whenever you have like a lot of information you're trying to store and you put some stuff somewhere in the room, and you can just kind of know, like,
you can kind of use this different like type of memory, this like geographic memory, where it's like, oh yeah, that thing lives physically over there, that thing lives physically over there. It's different than when it's just all on a 2D surface on a screen.
Yeah, this used to happen more before the world of GPS driven maps. But when you give someone directions, and maybe you give them like walking directions in your neighborhood, and you're like, okay, yeah, so you go down and you're gonna see like this big tree, and then you're gonna like this whole part of your brain that if you're on a whiteboard that's on screen, that part is not engaged. I don't think.
Whenever somebody gives me directions like that, I'm like, and then like the second they stop, I'm like, I didn't catch any of that. Like, okay, the big tree, okay, the third house, all right,
so much work totally to lost. Picture it, to construct that 3D world in your mind. My GPU is not up to the task. Oh man,
we're getting to be slightly old models, slightly outdated models. So
that's right. Yeah. Speaking of which, I just recently heard that possibly the first GPU, like the first time that concept was really used, where it was a separate processor that was just processing graphics, is the Nintendo Entertainment System.
No way.
They wanted to they spent a really long time developing it and this happened kind of during the video game crash in the US, but they developed it originally for the Japanese market.
Yeah.
But part of the CEO's vision was this thing that's going to be way ahead technologically of the competition.
Yeah.
But also inexpensive. And so the combination of those constraints, and they're like, it's okay if it takes us a really long time to build it, but we want to do those two things. We want it to be way ahead of the competition and also inexpensive. And usually you can't be like better and cheaper, but this notion that they spent years figuring out, and what they came up with was, well, we're going to use these sort of off the shelf, even already in like 1983 or whenever they developed it, it was already an old processor, but we're going to pair it with another one that's going to render the graphics. And that actually was tough for other people to beat. It was way ahead of what other
that is fascinating
things were doing. And I heard this on on Acquired. This is the Acquired podcast. And it's more about business than it is about tech. So I don't, they were sort of like, we think this is the first time there was a GPU, but we're not, so somebody might hear this and say, no, you're wrong. It was something else. But I thought that was pretty fascinating. Anyway, a total tangent from what we were talking about.
How did we get there? Oh,
we were talking about directions. We were talking about physical versus virtual meetings, and the power that has been durable of our get together, or at least durable for 1 week, because this was just last week. But this week we've been working with those same teams over video, and it's remarkable to me seeing people over video, talking to them over video now after having met them last week. It's so different because most of the time with our startups, we go a long time before we meet them in person. We might not meet them in person until after we've made an investment, and maybe they come to our annual meeting, or maybe we're visiting their city and then we meet them in person. This was so different. We meet in person right at the get-go, and then now we're over video. And again, it sounds kind of silly because in the normal way of doing things, you do start out in person, but that there's something really valuable to it. In person is special. And I remember this from the days of working at Google and working in the Seattle area, in our office in Kirkland, which is across the lake from Seattle. And that was where the engineering office was in Seattle. And the Gmail team who I was working with was in Mountain View. And so I'd be working with the engineers that I worked with in Kirkland. And then once a month, I would go down to visit Mountain View. And you probably did you experience this too? Because you were in the Chicago office at first.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, definitely. Because I worked at a startup called FeedBurner in Chicago. It was acquired by Google 2007, and most of the teams that I was working with were working on ads. So both
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
the publisher side of like, where did the AdSense is the name of the program, like ads that show up on publisher websites, but then also the advertiser side. So AdWords, which is like the tools to place your ads. And so those teams were like a lot of them were in New York. So I remember like I would take day trips from Chicago to New York. And some of them were in Mountain View. So I would also travel out to the Bay Area quite a lot.
Did you ever have to, figure out a cadence, a length of trip? What were those trips look like for you? And what was your goal when you traveled?
I remember that my goal particularly, so it was a little bit different. So the Mountain View trips to me were more about relationships. It was more about just hanging out with people and kind of being around and like going to lunch and like just, sort of getting to know the teams a little bit better. The New York trips I recall were often much more about having that very high bandwidth communication pipe, sort of that opportunity to like just sit down next to somebody and just like hammer through a bunch of decisions, like, pair designing, like two people looking at like, I guess fireworks, probably what we used back then to like design the UIs and just be like, okay, I was thinking we should do this here. And they're like, no, what if we did it this way? I'm like, okay, cool. Let's do it. Great. Okay. Next. Like, and from Chicago, I could fly in New York by like 9 a.m. or 10 a.m. pretty easily, like for a day trip. And I could spend like multiple hours there, just like cranking through stuff with the teams there. And then fly back and be back by like 7 or 8 at night.
Yeah. Wow. As a side note here, a sort of a footnote, I guess, fireworks, when John says fireworks, he's not talking about literal fireworks. Fireworks was a design tool, a drawing tool that, it was a weird tool that we used at Google to design the UI back in the 2000s. To draw pictures, because it was pixel by pixel, and that's the way we were thinking about things for screens. And it's of course been replaced by Sketch and now Figma, but it was like, for us, it was Figma at that time.
Totally. Yeah. And it was it was similar to Figma in the sense that it was one of the few tools that really was native to designing for on-screen, designing for UIs. Like Photoshop was always about like the name implies, like editing photos. Illustrator was, again, as the name implies, always about like creating like illustrations or artwork. But Fireworks really was for like designing on-screen graphics. It was one of the like quirkiest, weirdest tools, but it pioneered some pretty interesting concepts. Like, what are they called I think in Figma, they're called components, or symbols. Like basically this idea, maybe I'm thinking of, they're called something different in Webflow as well. But this idea that you could have like, if it's like a button, you can like create that button as like an object, and then you can like have that same button design show up everywhere. And if you edited like the color or like the curvature, then it would update everywhere. But you could also have like aspects of that element, like the label, the text label, that could be different per instance of the button. And that's something that like I think we sort of take for granted now in design tools. But I think Fireworks created that. Like I think they were the ones to come up with that idea.
Which is really a wild idea to come up with from now, if you don't have that idea. And then, it's a huge one. I mean, I'd come from working at Microsoft, and there we would design our mockups using Photoshop, which is not
such a pain.
Not intended for that kind of work. And Fireworks, it was better, even though it was like in many ways, like a lower quality product. I could just, Photoshop had been around for many years and it's more robust at that time. But anyway, that's sorry about that diversion, but I get a little nostalgic for Fireworks. But that idea that you would make a trip in a day, and either to collaborate or to have that in-person, that sort of relationship booster, or both. And I would do the same thing from Seattle. I would go to Mountain View for a day, and leave in the morning, come back at night. And it was an interesting time at Google, because the teams were really pretty small, and it was sort of easy to go down and in a day meet the people you needed to meet with on maybe a few different projects, maybe meet a couple new people who were leading up other projects, and build this, like I always felt like you're kind of refilling a bank account of rapport, like when you're away from people for too long and working together, I think there's a natural thing that happens where we start to feel like they're the outsiders, and like our tribe is just the folks here. And
people get collapsed down into almost like an abstraction of a person instead of like a whole person.
Yes. And I think it's probably a survival thing from, like days of yore. Like you can read the people who you are around all the time. You can develop a confidence that they're trustworthy.
Right.
And when you haven't seen someone for a long time, you have to sort of redo all that assessment of, do I trust this person? Anyway, obviously we trust the founders that we invest in, but it's just a different feeling having come off of working in person. And now it just feels so much better working over video.
Totally.
I also, though, came out of that thinking, okay, I have a bunch of ideas for how to only do the physical stuff on the wall and on the whiteboard. That's really the most powerful, and do everything else using Miro, even in person, because it's going to be faster and more efficient. It's going to feel like we spent our time well. Although I still think we spent our time well, but we can do it even better next time.
Yeah. We're always trying to get better at how we run sprints and how we run character labs. It's
like Olympians. We're always looking to shave off that 100th of a second.
1/100th. Yeah. My favorite thing about doing character labs in person was being able to much more fluidly move between the teams and help them out. And this is really like part of our pitch to founders is when they participate in character labs that we're going to invest, that's sort of that's the table stakes, right? We're going to write a check, small investment in each of the companies, but then like we're going to work with them. Like they're going to get to work with us and with Eli, our partner, our co-founder, who's been a VC investor for almost 15 years now. And so that's like the promise, right? That's the pitch of Character Labs. And I think that the in-person version of it delivers on that promise much more fully than the remote version. And some of it just has to do with the physical or logistical ease of like, I'll just take 3 steps over here. And now I'm looking at the whiteboard for team X.
Yeah. It's funny to sort of, we were in this big room, like we booked this big, I don't know what, like massive conference room in a hotel. And that's where we were kind of camped out for 3 days. And so during that time, it's really cool. Like you walk around and like, okay, right now, all of these teams are working on their differentiation and they're figuring out like what's going to differentiate them from the competition. And so we can walk around and look, and we can just like drop in and get involved in that conversation. That was really cool.
Yeah. And we could be like, hey, like this, honestly, this doesn't feel that differentiated. Like, this doesn't feel like an area where you are really, where you really have an advantage over your competition. Right. So is there something else you can consider and be able to do that in like 30 seconds, just like step over and like do that.
So cool. And then the geographic reference, I can picture it in my head now when as we're online talking to these teams, I kind of like, okay, those guys, right. They were over there.
They were in that corner.
I can see their thing like on the wall. It's all like in my mind's eye. It's like, it's all there. That's the way our brains are wired. Like that's better. Anyway, TLDR, that was cool doing it in person, and also fun to be back home and be able to be in sprints every day, and then afterward be at home, which I dig too. So it's kind of the best of both worlds. And I don't think we could have done this long program so easily. It would have been very challenging to put this together and get the same kinds of teams as involved, as focused as they are, if we were trying to do the whole thing physically in person. So
just the logistics of where would we meet, where would we work?
Totally.
It'd be very challenging.
Yeah.
Actually, this is related to what we talked about at the very beginning. Like I'd had like email installed on my phone all last week, because in addition to Character Labs, we were hosting our annual meeting, which had about 95 people, many of our investors, so our LPs, and then many founders, not just the ones who were in Character Labs, but other founders we've invested in. everybody was gathered together and I was like running that meeting. So I had email on my phone. I was like this very like sort of busy kind of like lots of moving pieces over the weekend. So we like had the annual meeting on Tuesday, and on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday was character labs. I uninstalled email from my phone. I didn't look at my email from Friday night until Monday morning, which I don't know the last time I have taken that long of a break from email, but it was like a very good and very needed reset from the intensity of last week.
Part of our whole mode of operation for the last decade plus has been we will do something that's radically different from the way other investors work. We're going to work together with teams in these like intense bursts where it's days, even weeks at a time, working together all day, every day, and trying to line those up when it's a great moment for the company, when it's when they need that help, like, great, we can offer this to you. To do that though, we have to make sure we're marshaling and balancing our own energy in the right way, because like you can't do that every day. You can't do that every week. And I remember like a high water mark in terms of number of sprints per year. There's probably a time at Google Ventures where we did like maybe up to like 30 in a year or something. And it was just almost every week. You'd occasionally have a week off. And it was something that, a younger Jake could do for like a year or 2 years. And like but it's like, it's not sustainable in the long term. You have to figure out how to balance it so you're really doing the best work. And also so you have enough time to have these other conversations with founders, to be picking good companies, and to be kind of aware of like, are we working in the best way, and continuing to like find the best spot so that we're not just continuing to assume that the plan or approach that we came up with a decade ago is still the best one.
Yeah. The other cool thing that happened this week, actually, one of our portfolio companies was acquired.
Amazing.
Yeah, it's so really cool. Exciting.
Yeah. So this was an investment originally that you and Eli made. Would you like give me the quick backstory?
Yeah. Okay. So the company is called Reclaim, and they have a product that basically manages your calendar with AI. So
it's great.
You give it some information. You say, these are like my habits. I think they did a pretty good job with like the nouns in the product. Like they have habits. So it's like, what are the things you want to make sure that you do that often, kind of get pushed to the side, like exercise, lunch, leaving the office at a certain time, whatever. Sort of define those things. Tell Reclaim about those things. The next noun is tasks. So it's like, what are the work projects you need to get done? And a lot of times that comes from like a task management system. People use all different tools for that. And then meetings are the other thing. So you kind of tell it the meetings you need to have, and Reclaim sort of shuffles all those things up, just like you would imagine if you had like a really great assistant working with you, is kind of lay out your calendar in an optimal way. And there's a bunch more to it, of course, but that's kind of the simple concept. And a few years ago, this was in 2020, Eli and I we basically had decided we were going to start Character, but we hadn't raised our first fund yet. We were still kind of in the planning period. And I had been writing a newsletter back then called Time Dorks, which became Make Time, our second book. And I remember I had written about this idea of scaffolding in your day, in your schedule, and that you should set up some scaffolding. Just like you're painting a building, you could put up a ladder and you could paint, but then you'd have to you'd have to climb down, move the ladder, go back up the ladder, paint again. Right. Very inefficient. If you put up the scaffolding, you can stand there, you've got a nice solid surface, it's secure, it's safe, and then you can just move. You could paint, you can work freely, you can use both of your hands. And I think if you can create some scaffolding in your schedule, you can say, these are the big building blocks of my day. These are the things that are important. I need to make sure that I eat and that I exercise and I have time to unwind, and that you can work with both hands. You can be more free to do the work that really matters to you. So I had written a newsletter about this, and I get a response from Patrick Lightbody, and Patrick is the founder of Reclaim. And he said, hey, love your newsletter. We actually have built a lot of these ideas into our product Reclaim. And one thing that people listening should know about me and you is that we have tried like a zillion different, like, productivity, like tools and different calendars, and,
Totally.
similar to like buying, if there's a new type of phone available, we'll try it out, or a new type of,
we're going to try it.
device, we're going to try it. Like same for software, right? If there's a new thing that's going to like help us, like, our use of our time, like we're going to try it. So I had tried a lot of things and I was a little skeptical at first, but I checked out the product and it was really interesting. It worked really well. So Eli and I got really excited about investing, but we hadn't raised the first character fund yet. So we invested, he and I, as individuals. Later, we ended up transferring those shares into the first character fund. But yeah, that was the backstory of our investment in Reclaim.
But I remember John introducing me to the idea of like, you got to kind of design your day in the calendar, and then the calendar becomes reality. So that's a way to like control reality for yourself. That's a good, powerful concept on the individual level. It's really hard to create software that will make that happen, that make like an individual habit concept come into real life.
And so many people have tried.
Yes. Yeah. So many people have tried to do those things, and especially something that can do it at the level, not just of like help any individual access it, but help like a team of people access it. Here we sound like we're giving like a big pitch for Reclaim, and at this point it doesn't matter, they've already been purchased, so you could use them or not. We just recommend it because it's a product that might help you in your life, but we will not accrue any future benefit.
Probably won't be acquired again.
It won't be acquired again.
So so it was it started as this angel investment by me and Eli, and then a character ended up investing a couple of times. We made an initial investment, and we ended up then making sort of a big bet on the company, making quite a large investment. And part of why we decided to make that large investment was because we had worked, in between sort of the beginning and then that big bet. Like we had worked with them. We had worked with Patrick and Henry, his co-founder, and gotten to know some of the rest of the team. We had run sprints with them. I remember, you mentioned in passing this foundation sprint, which is what we do in Character Labs. And one of the earliest foundation sprints that we ran, we had a different name for it back then. We called it an opportunity sprint, which is, we could probably spend 3 hours describing the differences. We won't, we'll spare you that. It
won't be our most popular episode, but it'll probably come out at some point. I don't think we'll be able to keep that in.
The 10-hour episode, maybe like, what's that Taylor Swift song that has like the 8-minute version? All Too Well, I think it's called. There's like the normal length, and then there's like a version of the song that's like 8 minutes long. Anyway, we had run basically a foundation sprint with them. They were kicking off a new project. So they already had, Reclaim existed in the market, but they were at this important moment for the company where they were going from like single player mode. So it was a tool you would use to help manage your own calendar, to like multiplayer mode, which is where you could now use Reclaim in a team inside like a company. It becomes like exponentially more complicated, more challenging from a technical perspective, but also from a product perspective, because you're just having to think about, just anytime you sort of open multiple calendars to see like, oh, let me try to schedule a meeting, it's automatically tricky. And then think about like a UI for doing that in an automated way. It's just like this potential like complete, black hole of like complexity and discussions and debates about like the best way to do it. I think now they're, at the time of the acquisition, they had like 300,000 monthly active users. I think more than 40,000 companies are using Reclaim. So they grew quite quickly. And so when we see that combination of like, okay, there's strong quantitative evidence that you're onto something, and we've been able to see behind the curtain and work with the team in a sprint and build our own conviction, that's sort of the magic recipe for us to make an even bigger investment into a company, which we did in the case of Reclaim.
Yeah, cool story and pretty exciting. I think that my hope is this will mean a lot more people see this product and get it in their hands.
Yeah.
And I know that was a lot of the motivation for the founders was like, hey, a lot of people use Dropbox. It's not easy to grow an audience as a tool that you use at work. A lot of people do already have Dropbox in their work life. So we hope that it'll get to a lot more folks and help them make better use of their time. That's kind of
that's like ground zero.
Yeah.
One final cool thing about this is that the acquisition of Reclaim by Dropbox was really driven by the CEO of Dropbox, and he actually when Dropbox went public in 2018, the CEO Drew described this future where essentially a tool like Reclaim would exist. And I just pulled it up, and he wrote, imagine getting to work in the morning to find your calendar reorganized so you have a 3-hour block of time to actually focus. Imagine starting your day and seeing the perfect to-do list, one based on a deep understanding of your priorities and your team priorities. So Drew Houston, CEO of Dropbox, he wrote this in 2018 in the filing, when the company went public. He was like, this is part of the vision of the company.
Yeah.
And so then fast forward to early 2024, 6 years later, and Reclaim had not built all of that quite, but had a pretty darn good start on building that. So when they got connected, it was just really good alignment between what the Reclaim founders were trying to do and what Dropbox was trying to do. It's definitely great to see that it wasn't just about, the financial side of it, the deal, which of course is important for us as investors, but to see that there's something more to this acquisition.
Yeah, totally. It'll be really interesting to see what happens. I mean, as we all sort of know, Dropbox is this ubiquitous utility. And then I think they have been trying really hard to figure out how they grow beyond being this ubiquitous file utility. And they have a lot of software tools. And like I said, a huge audience with a lot of people who use the product. But for many people, it's just thing that just works.
Runs in the
I don't
background.
think about it. It's just a pipe. It's a way I send links to people to files, and the ways I make sure that my files are on different computers and it just works. And that's a really good, from our standpoint, being super time nerds, but that's a really powerful vision to have in the pre-AI boom. What if AI was sort of doing this for you?
Yeah. Well, before we sign off, should we share a couple of recommendations? You have anything to talk about? Actually, I'm gonna kick off. I'm gonna answer my own question. I have a request for a recommendation. I recently was looking for a great timer app for my phone, and it's been a while since I looked for an app like this, but there's really a lot of junky apps out there. I want a timer that just will repeat. So I want to set a time, 2 minutes, and just have it count to 0 and then to start over again.
Okay. What are you going to use it for?
I am using it for stretching, basically. I have a bunch of different stretches that I do, and this is maybe too nerdy, but I do the math. I'm okay, I have 15 minutes before my next thing. So it's seven blocks of 2 minutes is 14. So I can just do 2 minutes of each of these stretches. That's 7 stretches.
That's great. When I have 15 minutes before doing something, I get distracted for 20 minutes. That's usually my approach. So I applaud you. I actually have, I may have the thing for you.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. The Bit Timer app.
Is this one that we used to use a long time ago in sprints?
Yes. And I think it's still great.
Still good. Okay.
I'm looking in the App Store. I've used it not long ago,
Yeah.
but I'm looking in the App Store right now because I want to make sure that
timer.
Sometimes you end up with an old version of an app that's better, and then they chunk it up somehow. No, Bit Timer's still there. Look, not very popular. It only has,
which is kind of a good sign. Weirdly.
Yeah, totally.
It means
right.
They haven't gone into App Store spamming or advertising or you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's I think it's just a simple app that a guy made, and it's well designed. Yeah, it just works. So developed by Peter Buick, just looks like a a guy.
Just a guy who wanted a great timer app as badly as I do.
Yeah. So
but he did something about it.
it's great. Nice visual design, good sound effects. Just does that. It's just a timer. It's great.
Well, anybody, if you're listening and you have any suggestions, you can send us an email.
Can you beat BitTimer? That would be
Can you
phenomenal.
beat BitTimer? Yeah. Request for recommendation.
Yeah.
One other quick thing on that, I probably tried like 10 different apps. Like this was over the weekend. I was like looking for an app. One of them that I installed, and apps have gotten like really aggressive about the in-app purchases with like subscriptions.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Into this. Yeah. It's people wanting to make money. Ugh.
Yeah. Crazy. I installed one, and there was no free trial. It was like, okay, wow, you have installed this app. It was like free in the App Store, but in-app purchases. And then the first screen was subscribe now. And the price, guess the price. Guess the subscription price for a timer app.
Of a what? A timer?
It was just a timer app. Yeah. Yeah. It was a per week subscription.
Per week? I mean, I'm trying to think in my mind what's the least amount that you can actually bill on the App Store, because I mean, given that the BitTimer exists and is so great and is, I don't know if it's free or if you pay like a one-time thing, but like 49 cents a week, like what least you can pay 49 cents.
Oh yeah.
A week,
yeah. I don't know.
Yeah. That's my guess.
This one app the price was $17 per week.
What? Wow. I can't fathom what you'd be timing where it would be worth that much, because we all have, like, if you have a phone, you do have like a decent timer.
Yeah, it's fine. Yeah.
Timer on phones is like not bad.
Yeah, it doesn't repeat, but is that worth $17 a week?
Like I'll manually repeat for like $18. I mean, unless you're just, that's all you're doing 24 hours. Wow. That's a bold move.
Somebody I know.
Really
I'm sure it's just a dark pattern for like I want the app, click.
I want the app, click. And I think I'm just paying for it once. And I think it's like $1. Yeah. That's yeah. Wow. That's wild. Yeah. Anyway. I was, so I also on that, here's my recommendation for people, because it sort of segues. It's these episodes on the podcast Acquired about the history of Nintendo.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So you were talking about earlier.
It's really like 3 episodes. It's 2 about Nintendo, 1 about like Nintendo from the founding of the company, which is actually in like the 1890s up until the sort of late 1990-ish, which leaves them like kind of on the top of the world, dominant with and then I'm not going to go too into it because I'm super fascinated by Nintendo and have read some other stuff about their history. And maybe that'll be a deeper dive on a future podcast. But that's episode 1, is like from the 1800s to like NES dominant. And then
what did Nintendo do in the 1890s?
I mean, playing cards.
Playing cards. Okay.
Yeah. And originally it was like a cement company. And then they shifted to, they created this new company basically with I think the capital from which
the owner had a great passion for games.
Well, playing cards, I think it was a big business opportunity because they had been illegal in Japan, and they became legal, but gambling was still illegal.
Okay.
But like gambling was how people like really used playing cards, because like in a casino, if you were gambling, you would use a fresh deck, again and again and again. And so their main customers for a long time were like the mob, basically, like the Yakuza. But like over time, they got into doing other kinds of like games and toys. And then that was sort of what interested them and made them aware of like the emerging world of like arcade games and then ultimately consoles. But the first episode, and Acquired, which is I have not listened to this podcast before, but it's sort of, profiles of businesses, and it's long form. So they're like, each episode's like 3+ hours. Yeah. So it's enjoyable to listen to, but they go up to 1990. The second episode is about like basically up until today. And it's also interesting because Nintendo just basically has this cyclical pattern of like big hits and then big flops, and seeing how they manage. Anyway, we'll go into it a bit in a future episode. But the third episode is about Sega, how Sega kind of took over the market from Nintendo in the 90s and then lost it, and like almost went out of business. And that's fascinating too. The whole thing is fun, especially if like me, you like lived through that as a kid, and
Yeah.
so really fun. But the hosts were talking about Apple and how Nintendo and Apple there's a bit of a similarity in terms of wanting to really put the customer first
Yeah.
and really have this like walled garden and high quality. We're going to be the gatekeepers and make sure that the games that are available on the console, in the case of Nintendo, or the apps that are available on the App Store are like of a higher quality.
Yeah.
And that's sort of a promise to you. The hosts are sort of making the point that Apple kind of set out to do that, but the App Store has really like devolved over the years, as it has been a bigger and bigger like cash cow, perhaps.
Right.
Like it's very hard to say no to revenue.
Plus, hardware sales have like plateaued in a lot of categories for Apple.
Yeah.
They're still selling, literal boatloads of everything, but like they're not growing as fast. Meanwhile, like their services, like apps, like subscriptions for like Apple TVs, like that stuff continues to grow. So it's really important for the future of the company.
And it's interesting to see, where do they lose their stamina for their standards? And I mean, the fact that like the parental controls don't reliably work on everybody's phones, and like it's kind of spotty. Like some people I know are like, no, I can turn Safari off, and because of writing the distraction-free iPhone articles and Make Time, like I hear from people about this, and it's mixed. And like my son does it actually, and he's like, yeah, like I got it to work after trying like 20 times. It just like one time worked, and now I just am not touching it. But like when they launched Screen Time, they never would have let this happen that year, like their attention was on it, but they didn't have the stamina to keep making sure that everything works, because it's not a big part of their business. It's like, it's just a good enough promise. And it's sad when you see that happen, but that happens. And that's kind of the App Store too. Like, can you imagine if in the early days of the App Store, when, Steve Jobs was like on stage talking about how like, well, we don't need fart sound apps, like if there had been a timer that charged $18 a week to use, and like people would have noticed, because when there weren't a lot of apps, people would have been like, wait, look at this is crap, like this is just taking advantage of people. And now you cut to like, well, 14 years later, like their standards might be a little looser for what they allow in the App Store, because they're reviewing everything. Hypothetically, in theory, they should know that that's the business model for that app, and that it's probably just hooking people in and then like silently paying their subscription. The other thing is, if you try to ever unsubscribe from something that you've subscribed to on the phone, or especially if it's something your kid has subscribed to, it's almost impossible. Like you have to look up a help app, and like you have to go into like iTunes on their computer. Like it's just It's just,
I've been down that path.
Yeah. It's like clearly they don't want you to figure it out. Like, everything else is just, tap in here and it's just a little switch in settings, and it's like right there. They don't want you to unsubscribe.
Like trying to unsubscribe from the newspaper.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. It's interesting. And, it kind of comes back to like story about Dropbox acquiring Reclaim. That's something that like we have very limited control over as investors, but it is something that we think about, and like, talking to founders about how to make those decisions. And it is important to try to think about the longevity of the product and where your vision that we also see founders when they're just in the early stages beginning with, what's the best chance that has of living on for as long as possible and having the best incarnation in the real world. And we have like optimism about it, but it's tough in the real world. Anyway, I would request recommendations from listeners for stuff that you've read or heard about Nintendo's history that you found interesting, because I'm really fascinated on the topic right now. And I've read a couple of books about the sort of the consoles, especially for me, it's really fascinating, like the 70s, 80s, 90s, what happened there. One that's on my reading list is Console Wars. I hear about that one a lot. But it's just such a fascinating story about differentiation and figuring out how to stand out from the competitors, because it's tangible, because a lot of us have had like a visceral experience with these products. I just think there's a lot of interesting lessons. So if you've heard of something great, if you've heard a great podcast, great interview, let me know. All right. I think that's good for today. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Yeah. Thanks so much. And if you want to find out about the work that we do with founders, you want to learn more about Character, go to character.vc. If you want to find out about new episodes of this podcast, Please subscribe. We would really appreciate that, whether that's Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you like to listen, or go to thesprintbook.com. You can sign up for our newsletter there, and we'll send you an email when we've got something to share. Anything else, Jake?
No, have an excellent day. We'll see you.
All right. Until next time.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
This is Jake and Jay-Z. This is Jake and Jay-Z.